I'm Theda Braddock. I teach environmental law here, and this book is the one that I will start talking to you about today. I'm going to talk mostly about federal law at the beginning here, and we'll get into state law a little bit later on. I wrote the first edition of this book in 1995, and it's been my observation that the science and legal part of wetland law has gone through fashions. In 1995, anytime the government came in and tried to tell you what you couldn't do in your wetland, you filed a complaint under the Federal Civil Rights Statute, 42 USC 1983. That was very au courant at the time. A few years go by, more regulation goes on. Corps of Engineers initially did not want to have to do the regulation, but they were kind of dragged kicking and screaming into doing it, and they've actually gotten pretty good at it since then. But they refined their regulations, they refined their definitions, they tried to respond to litigation, and they went ahead and continued to regulate wetlands. So the second edition of the book was about, oh my God, you've regulated my wetland to the point where you have destroyed all its value, so you might as well take it, government body, and pay me. Well, that was the fashion then. Finally, the Supreme Court said, well, there is some residual value, so the government hasn't taken all of it. One particular case in South Carolina, they said, as a matter of fact, you could make it a park. Okay, where's the money in that, right? As long as there's any residual value, there's no taking under the over-regulation theory. So that was the second edition. Third edition comes along, and I now have yet a new part of this whole study. Diane Hennessy, my lovely co-author, wrote the science chapters in this book, and they're very important. Wetland science has come a long way since we used to fill them in because they caused disease and stank, right? They're actually a very important part of our landscape and have many functions. But like I say, there is now yet a new fashion, and there's wetland science, which Diane took care of, wetland law, which I think at this point I can take care of, but we are now in the realm of wetland politics. I will explain. Under federal law, the source of Congress's power to regulate wetlands is the Commerce Clause, and under the Commerce Clause, they have jurisdiction over navigable waters, okay? Across the interstate navigable waters, Congress regulates. So all those channel markers you see out there, Congress put them there. But they had power to regulate navigable waters, and they decided that the waters were getting too polluted after the Cuyahoga River caught on fire for the third time. Congress goes, yeah, well, we need to do something. So they amended what had been the Federal Water Pollution Control Act in 1972 and renamed it the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act never mentions the word wetland. It is nowhere in the statute. Regulations, yes. Statute, no. But the purpose of the Clean Water Act, after the Cuyahoga River caught on fire, is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of waters of the United States. Those are traditionally navigable waters and their tributaries, right? So they never mention wetlands, but they say we're trying to restore and maintain basically clean water. The Clean Water Act forbids the discharge of a pollutant into waters of the United States without a permit, and the Corps and EPA are responsible for handing out the permits. That's a very shorthand version of a whole nother story. States are required to develop water quality standards. Washington State has its own water quality standard. And for waters that don't meet those standards, the states are responsible for setting total maximum daily loads of pollution that can go into that water before it will violate the water quality standard. Now, let's go back. Remember, I told you that wetlands are not mentioned, but waters of the United States are in the Act. So What is a water of the United States and why are wetlands in there? Well, let's go look at the science chapters first. As Diane explains to you, a wetland is a transitional zone between open water and dry land. Well, good. But the law requires a bright line. There has to be a boundary. Now, we've got all the scientists saying, it's this fuzzy area out there that's not that or that, it's this. And the law is saying, no, we need a boundary. So that's the problem that I'm sure Diane deals with all the time, is drawing the line around a wetland. It's very difficult. I've spoken to some people who do it who say, actually, the easiest way to do it is with the vegetation, because you have to have hydric soils, the presence of water, and hydrophytic vegetation, water-loving vegetation. And generally speaking, the plants kind of know where to grow. So you go out and look at the plants, and that can give you the boundary of the wetland. Remember that thought, though, okay? At any rate, so the question is, we've got these wetlands, and we want to regulate them, and people get all haired up about whether or not you're going to come in and tell them what they can and can't do on their own property. Cutting a long story very short, one case I want to talk to you about today is U.S. versus Rapanos. They were planning, obviously, to build houses in a wetland, and the Corps came in and said, you can't do it because those are wetlands. And they said, well, they're near man-made ditches, and the ditches are ultimately connected to a tributary of navigable water. But the wetland itself, it doesn't have an obvious water connection. So that case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and we ended up, as you know, there are 9 justices on the Supreme Court. We ended up with 4, 4, and 1. The 4 dissenters said, hey, the purpose of the Clean Water Act is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity. Therefore, anything that doesn't do that is against the law. Boom. The guys over here, Scalia most notably, who wrote that opinion, said, oh no, wetlands, you got to be able to see them. They've got to have a continuous surface water connection to a navigable water. And again, I ask you to read the science chapters. Not every wetland has an obvious surface water connection. And we also already know that there are many underground connections. Remember, though, the Clean Water Act does not regulate groundwater, but hold that thought. There's a case before the Supreme Court right now where in Hawaii, they dumped raw sewage down a well, okay? Gone, forgotten, there, we took care of it. And eventually the GAC percolated through the groundwater and came out at a beach in a navigable water. Is there jurisdiction? Can we make the sewage company get a permit for dropping the stuff down the well that ended up out there? I don't know. We'll find out. That's before the Supreme Court right now. But because of this case, there was one guy in the middle. Remember I told you Justice Kennedy, who just retired, and that's how we get, well, never mind. Justice Kennedy said, no, there doesn't have to be a surface water connection, but there does need to be a nexus, a connection. So under the Kennedy definition, the Hawaii case, you've got the nexus underground where it's getting into the water, the navigable water. So Kennedy says it has to have a significant nexus, meaning that wetlands, either alone or in combination, significantly affect. In other words, the proof's in the pudding. If the sewage is out there at the beach in the navigable water, then there's a connection, right? Okay, well, the poor Corps didn't know what to do with the Rapanos decision. They've got to have regs, and they've got to go out and find stuff to delineate wetlands. So under the Obama administration, they came up with a new rule. 1 minute? They came up with a 2015 rule, okay? And they held 400 meetings around the country, took 1 million comments, wrote the rule, put it out under the Administrative Procedure Act as a final rule, whereupon in 2015, 13 states got it enjoined. The rule took effect in 37 states. There was a big fuss and fume about whether or not you could even go to the particular court that they went to. The Supreme Court decided just last year that you can't. So it went back. Okay. The problem that we have now is, Trump signed an executive order announcing that he had just repealed the 2015 rule. Now, I knew that's not possible because of the Administrative Procedure Act, but there you have it. But in his executive order, he told the Corps and EPA to go back and consider writing a rule that contains the Scalia language about continuous surface water connection. Okay? Science? Nah, just politics. All right. So that's federal law. I also wrote another book this year. Here it is. Oops. California. And just after this book came out, California, of course, is a state, and states regulate wetlands too. So does Washington. California came out and said, well, whoa, we better get going here. They've been looking at writing their own wetland regulation for 10 years. They have now put out their draft version that will cover all the wetlands that are not going to be covered by federal law. So before you burst into tears and go screaming home, there's always state law. The problem is the state, okay? If you look at, like after the midterms, a red and blue map of the United States, the blue states, there are 22 states that are still following the 2015 rule, and there's the remaining states, 28, who are not. So the country's divided, and the 22 that do are the blue states. So Washington, of course, we have our own wetland regulation, and it's really quite good, done by ecology. So like I say, before you get too concerned about there being no regulation of wetlands, there will be, but it's important to live in the right state. And we do. Thank you.